who's joined us and came on right at 8 o'clock, welcome. I'm so grateful that you could join us. My name is Michael Jazz, and I'm the Executive Director of the Relationship Foundation. I am a trauma and neuroscience researcher. I work with schools and social service organizations, and I'm explaining to them and us adults how we can make the world a safer place for children of all ages, as well as ourselves. I love being in a position to bring this work to hundreds of schools in New York City and organizations around the world, and to thousands of people through these webinars. One last time, would you please put in the chat where you are from, what school or organization you are with? And we really appreciate getting to know who's joined us. And please, if you are simply an interested observer. Now, before we move forward, as I said, a disclaimer. We'll be talking about various forms of trauma, neglect, and abuse. And we want everyone who's joined us to do whatever is in your best interest for self-care. Let's go to the next slide. Before I say a few words about our organization, I want to mention that I will, throughout this presentation, be referring to my childhood trauma as an example of what can happen to any child. Because of my trauma, I almost failed out of school. And with my trauma, the part of the brain that governs memory did not develop properly. So I will be reading some of what has been written for this webinar, and I thank you for your understanding. I made it through childhood, but not without my fair share of struggles. So the main reason I have for doing this work is I don't want kids to suffer the way I did. And we want to get to them before they harm themselves or others. As we go on, I urge you to reflect for yourself if any of what is shared tonight is relevant to you personally, and especially to any children in your life. The Relationship Foundation is dedicated to helping school children, as well as adults, to embrace relationship skills with critical thinking, empathy, and respect. We do this through workshops and with schools and community service organizations. We've developed an innovative program and a curriculum called Healthy Relationships 101. We've been introducing this in New York City schools since 2008. Our curriculum contains all of what will be shared today and more. We have an extensive section at the beginning of our curriculum on the subjects we are going to be discussing now. For those of you from organizations, we also have a guidebook based on the same principles as our curriculum. We work with various community service organizations, from indigenous nations to Rikers Island prison counselors. For several years, we have been working with Child Advocacy Centers, also known as CACs. They are child-focused facilities that provide children who have suffered abuse with long-term advocacy and care. Please make a note of this organization, Child Advocacy Centers. They are in every state, and they have centers throughout each state, and they provide an extraordinary service for children in need. Now, throughout this presentation, we're going to closely examine a research project called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which we'll be referring to as the ACE study. The ACE study began from the research of Dr. Vincent Felitti in the mid-90s. He posed this question: what would it take to turn gold into lead? If we took these babies with extraordinary potential and said, we had 20 years to develop them into the people you see to the right of the slide, what would we have to do to accomplish that? We would have to look at their home and school lives and what they might have encountered that would have led to this outcome. We're going to explain how this can be prevented. We're going to look at the origin of these conditions and the problems the people on the right have faced, and we're going to see how these situations, of course, can result not only in homelessness, but in behaviors that can lead to deep emotional distress, poor health, and often early death. Trauma has recently gained wider acceptance as a way to understand mental health issues. and it's becoming more a part of our society's dialogue. Yet there is still a wide gap in the knowledge of how it affects children, their brain development, and their ability to thrive, learn, and flourish. Let's go to the next slide. For those of you who have just joined us, would you please put in the chat where you are from and what school or organization you are with, or if you are simply an interested individual. We really appreciate knowing who's joined our webinars. As was mentioned in this presentation, we will be talking about various forms of trauma, neglect, and abuse. Earlier, we stated this, that these are sensitive topics, and we want you to do whatever is in your best interest for self-care. For many of us, trauma was a part of our early neurological imprint, and it laid the groundwork for how we would relate to others, how successful our relationships would be, and how we would nurture and raise children. Early childhood adversity profoundly alters children's developing brain architecture and their immunology. It affects it in ways that can have long-lasting effects. Our adult life is inextricably linked to our childhood experiences, and given the chronic stress many of us faced when we were very young, our bodies and brains became steeped in inflammatory chemicals. These chemicals affect our brain function. When they are released, rational thinking such as focus, decision-making, learning, and planning all go offline. These chemicals activate the fight, flight, or freeze response. Much of a child's suffering is a direct result of how adults, both parents and teachers, are interacting with them. Our childhood experiences affect our mental and physical health and affect the way our lives play out. It's imperative that adults become aware of the science of childhood brain development and how abuse and neglect can disrupt it. We are imploring parents and caregivers to understand that their treatment of children can have lifelong consequences. Here we see a healthy brain compared to one that has experienced what is known as complex trauma. This illustration provides insight into how trauma affects the brain. The child's brain on the right has large, dark areas where there's diminished brain development. On the left is a scan of a healthy child's brain. The amazing thing about our brains is that they are able to regenerate damaged tissue, so the brain on the right can become like the healthy brain on the left. Tonight, we'll share how this can be accomplished. With the discovery of enhanced imaging technology, we can now see how the brain can change its shape and structure. Our brains have the ability to create new neurological pathways. This is called neuroplasticity. Our brain has an amazing ability to rewire, learn, grow, and heal. Neuroplasticity also means we can unlearn negative behaviors and thus respond to stress in a more measured way. With a greater sense of safety or stability, the brain can begin to rewire and function in a healthier way. We've seen this with the students with whom we've worked, and it can work with us adults as well. The brain is the source of consciousness, ground zero for sensation, and the engine of needs, feelings, and empathy. It holds our life's memories and all of our fears, our dreams, and our loves. Today's presentation is also about building resilience to trauma. Learning about trauma is the first step to bring healing to it. One way to build resilience to trauma is having supportive relationships. The life skill, nonviolent communication, is one of the most effective ways to foster relationships that thrive and flourish. We'll briefly mention it today, but if you haven't heard of nonviolent communication, in 2 weeks, on November 21st at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be giving a webinar on NVC. This extraordinary communication skill set provides a roadmap, especially for children, to feel safe and secure. I'll say a bit more about NVC as we go on and during the Q&A. There's a link to it in the chat, and you can register for the Nonviolent Communication webinar tonight. So it'll be in your browser. Now, this recent period of the health crisis and schools being shut down for extended periods was traumatic beyond anything imaginable. Math and reading scores fell to levels they were 20 years ago. In some cases, up to 2 years of isolation had a devastating effect, especially for school-aged children. And it's not like kids have picked up where they left off. Nationwide, counselors are saying kids have fallen behind both academically and socially. In our upcoming Nonviolent Communication webinar, we will reveal how to cultivate healthy and thriving relationships that support healthy social interaction. Traumatic experiences collapse the structure of a child's world, and this can lead to dire consequences. 2 years to a 5-year-old is like a lifetime. In some cases, 2 years to a 17-year-old is like a lifetime. So mental health issues continue to soar for children of all ages. Here's some background on how the prevalence of trauma became well known, especially how it affects children. In the mid-90s, Dr. Vincent Felitti, who you see on the screen, was the medical director of a weight loss clinic in San Diego. He indirectly discovered that sexual abuse was prevalent amongst his clients, and this led to an expanded study of childhood maltreatment. This is the mid-90s, when the discussion of abuse was hardly seen and hardly heard of in the public. Dr. Felitti became concerned when many of his patients lost a lot of weight, but quit his program and then quickly gained it back. He decided at one point to reach out and ask some questions to anyone who would volunteer. This was at Kaiser Permanente, a healthcare program in San Diego. And he got 17,332 responses to volunteer. So this is what he set out to do to get a better understanding of why people left his program. When he met up with the first volunteer, he asked a few simple questions. How much did you weigh in first grade? How much did you weigh when you graduated high school? Now, he meant to say, how old were you when you first had sex, assuming it was as an adult. But mistakenly, he said, how much did you weigh when you first had sex? The woman said 40 pounds. She was sexually abused by her father when she was 4 years old. As he continued to interview others, he discovered that sexual abuse was quite prevalent, and he was very shocked, as there was, as I said, very little public awareness of this, even in the mid-90s. Moved by what he discovered, in collaboration with the CDC, he began a research study of child abuse. This led to a year-long investigation with over 17,000 people who volunteered to answer questions about childhood adversity. This was the start of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which we will go into in detail. Again, also known as the ACE study. An example of complex trauma that led to a severe health crisis was shared in a video entitled A Tribute to Dr. Felitti. If you have a pen and paper handy, make a note of this. It's on YouTube, A Tribute to Dr. Felitti. He told about a distant relative who was traumatized as a young man. When he was very young, his relative was obsessed with baseball. He wanted to play professionally someday, and it was really all he lived for. But his arm was broken when he was maybe about 12 years old. Later, he was unable to play baseball at all. He started drinking. He became obese. He got diabetes, and he died at the age of 40. In the video, Dr. Felitti says this incident was a tragic result of parental abuse, which is the root cause of so much of the unspoken suffering that children experience. He further said that the biggest public health advance we could make would be to figure out how to improve parenting. We recently started working with Dr. Felitti. He was a guest speaker at our day-long workshop that we did with the child advocacy centers in Pennsylvania, and he's endorsed our curriculum and our guidebook. Now, we're going to further share about the science of the brain and how trauma affects it. Recent studies show that trauma can be seen as the root cause for disruptive behavior. And for troubled families, understanding trauma can be a path to repair. So trauma doesn't have to be a life sentence. None of us are alone in our suffering. We covered this subject in depth last week when we were working in person with child advocates throughout the state of Illinois. And we went out there to their capital, Springfield. Now, as a result of Dr. Felitti's work, the ACE study is becoming more well-known throughout the country and around the world. The study identified 10 ACEs, as they're called. As I said, it was conducted in the mid-90s with 17,332 volunteer participants. The study revealed that 2/3 had at least one ACE, and 90% of those had two or more. Ironically, the people in the study were mostly white, middle class, and college educated. There was also a Philadelphia ACE study where the population is predominantly Black and Hispanic. There, 90% of the participants had at least one ACE. Here are the 10 ACEs: 3 abuse, 2 neglect, 5 family turmoil. Take a few moments to read this list, and it's already been put in the chat. Now, for those of you in the education and psychology fields, this list is a must. It can be so useful as a reference in your work. For parents, it's a must-have. I have 4 ACEs that I know of: parental mental illness, abandonment, neglect, and substance abuse. My dad smoked 2 packs of unfiltered Lucky Strike for 25 years. At first, these revelations were upsetting, and I had resistance to revisiting my past. I didn't want to look back on my lack of familial affection or parental disconnection, and the scars of growing up with emotional neglect, a depressed mother, and an absentee father. In my home, there were no books, there was no music, no one read to me, we had no conversations, no hikes, no hugs and kisses. It was like living in solitary confinement. But children under the age of 5 have no developed vocabulary to express what is happening to them. And the sadness in their lives, in my life, appeared to be normal. Children don't have the words to say, I'm lonely, I'm hurting. Too many of us have experienced a sense of being abandoned in childhood. I literally have no happy memories. Teachers, social workers, this may be the case for many of your students. Now, another way this plays out is the epidemic of loneliness, and the Surgeon General recently released a statement regarding the mental and physical health issues around this. Now, I do have 2 memories that I think were pretty positive. One is I was really afraid of dogs. And one day, I kind of remember my mom. I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a semi-detached home. Mom brought a dog onto the porch and put my hand on its neck, and I petted it. Well, for dog lovers, you know, at that moment, I exploded with joy, and I've been a dog lover ever since. So another thing that I want to recount is that there's a movie on Netflix. It's called Crazy Horse. And it's about an indigenous family that is rowing across the lake to escape the European descendants, who many of you know took children away from their reservations, even up until the 70s. And throughout the film, you see the plight of one of the children. And later at the end of the film, he has a memory looking back at the lake because his parents had to row away with his brother who was ill. And he cried out, "Mama, Papa." And I began to cry, wailing, because inside, I think, was a voice that I couldn't articulate, calling for my mom and dad. So for me personally, due to extreme neglect, I somewhat died inside. I did not have an adult to help me navigate through life's challenges. However, when I became aware of my ACEs, it helped me put into perspective how I had been held back in my life goals. And then things began to change. I began to have more clarity about my behavior, and this began a change for the better. Would you take a moment to reflect on any ACEs that may have occurred in your life? Please put in the chat how many ACEs you think you may have experienced. You can put it directly into the chat to me. It, of course, will not be shared. Now, this information is a way to begin self-reflection and, dare I say, healing. When I became aware of my ACEs, I then understood the root cause of what I was looking for in therapy, and it gave me the kind of clarity on my past that had previously eluded me. And then I had more clarity about behavior that needed to change. I was then able to get off the resentment track about not experiencing love at home. I'm sure my parents loved me and my sister, but I simply don't remember the experience of it. And I realized my parents were doing the best they could at a time when the information we now have was not available to them. Today, all I have from my parents is love, and I even dedicated my book to them. And our book is available on our website. So this new science of the adverse childhood experiences study has given us a different perspective on the challenges that so many children face. Now, we're going to look at a video where some individuals were also able to get clarity on their past.
It's time now, everyone. We're gonna do the Compassion Trauma Circle. Is everyone ready to face their past with compassion? Is that a yes? Yeah! While you were growing up, during your first 18 years of life, if a parent or other adult in the household often or very often would swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, step inside the circle. If a parent or other adult in the household often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or threw something at you, step inside the circle. If a parent or other adult in the household often or very often ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured, step inside the circle. If you often felt that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, step inside the circle. If your family lived in extreme poverty, step inside the circle. Step inside the circle. Step inside the circle. Step inside the circle.
There is no shame. There is no shame. There is no shame.
I'm so good. Good to see you. How are you? Amen. Noel, good to see you. Welcome. I was abused as a young girl. I was beaten by my mother. I was verbally abused by my mother. I was sexually abused by another man. My father was an alcoholic. My mother was a rageaholic. I've driven drunk. I've sold drugs. I was a juvenile delinquent. Probably my story is similar to most of your stories in here. I'm white and I'm female and nothing happened to me. So, I got a get out of jail free card. And so I'm here now because I see myself in every one of you.
I'm a traumatized child, raised by a traumatized child. My mother was traumatized as well as her parents.
Like he said, we wasn't born in the world of being evil people. My mother didn't want me. She hid her pregnancy. She tried to flush me down the toilet. But as I learned about these things, I always asked myself what was wrong with me.
When I come to the circle and I see everybody else and she's reading off the questions and people stepping in further, and I look at my childhood and I'm like, a lot of these people in this yard are just like me.
There was one step I should have taken that I didn't take, and I saw some of my brothers and my friends take that step, and I felt like such a coward. I wasn't brave enough to be there with them when they took that step. And every round after that, I took the most difficult step.
Our traumas kept us separated. We were all on the circumference, all standing apart. But once we began to acknowledge our traumas publicly, it brought us all closer together.
In prison, you're not supposed to show your weaknesses in prison, though. But to want to do that, to walk in that circle like that, and to take each step forward was a reminder to ourselves that we still have a humanity and we worthy to be loved, though. Most people on the outside don't understand that we want to change so we can re-enter society better than what we left it.
And I think one of the things that when you was yelling at no shame and you had us yelling it out, it was freeing us too. And it was a point to where when I was looking at that and we was all looking at it in a circle, you can hear that echo, no shame. And that was very powerful, especially coming from a little lady like you.
I'm 76 years old. I've seen a lot. I don't like talking. I like to meet people that understand what's happening without words, and you one of them. Today has been one of the best days I had in my whole entire life since I've been out to be 40 years.
Your true spirits are not violent. Your true spirits are magnificent.
Hi, my name is Fritzi Horseman, founder of the Compassion Prison Project. Thank you so much for watching our promo for Step Inside the Circle. We're asking for donations so that we can continue our urgent and important work, educating the public about the devastating effects of childhood trauma and bringing this awareness to the men, women, and children living in prison. Our mission is to transform prisons into places that focus on education, mental health, and rehabilitation. Your donations will help us advocate for trauma-informed care, community support, and a shift in the paradigm in how we incarcerate, isolate, and dehumanize the most traumatized members of our society. Thank you again for watching.
Let's take a few moments to reflect. Take a breath and think about what you feel having seen this video. And please put any responses you have to the film in the chat. We send Fritzy a copy of your responses, and it really lifts her spirits to see the effect her work is having. So please take a few moments to put a few words in the chat, and we will send them to her. Fritzy is traveling the country. She's speaking with superintendents of entire prison systems and urging them to abolish what is known as cruel and unusual punishment, which is solitary confinement. And Fritzy is also presented with us with some of the child advocacy centers and also with the schools in New York with whom we've worked. So thank you. I see quite a few messages in the chat. Thank you, everybody. We copy them and send them to Fritzy. Okay. Thank you again, everyone, for sharing your thoughts and feelings. So let's go to the next slide. In the early days of Dr. Felidi's study, you see here in this slide one of his weight loss clinics clients. She had lost nearly 300 pounds in a year's time in his program. We borrowed this slide from Dr. Felidi's presentation when we worked together at a CAC. So it's a little out of focus, but I think you'll get the picture. Sometime after this woman lost the weight, she was sexually propositioned by a much older man. Well, she had been sexually abused by her grandfather beginning at the age of 11, and that's why she initially started gaining weight. In reaction to being propositioned, she gained the weight back at a much more rapid rate than when she lost it. She gained 32 pounds in 3 weeks. Needless to say, she wanted to ward off compliments, especially from older men, that might remind her of her grandfather. Our society often judges people by their physique, having no idea of their previous experiences. Dr. Felidi found similar stories as he reached out to one after another of the participants in his clinic who had lost a tremendous amount of weight, but then gained it back much faster than when they lost it. This was an epiphany for him in realizing that there was a widespread issue with sexual abuse of which the public had little knowledge. This was over 30 years ago, when there was limited awareness about these issues. Dr. Felidi said at that time, nice people didn't ask the kind of questions that are in the ACE survey. However, during the course of the study, participants would come up to Dr. Felidi and thank him for being able to share secrets they had kept for a lifetime. As was stated earlier, the revelation of my ACEs put into perspective why I struggled so much my entire life with despair, depression, and disappointment in all my relationships. So knowing about one's ACEs has multiple benefits, and it's especially important to know how prevalent ACEs are for children. Now ACEs can be identified as the root cause of behavior issues and not because of a character defect. With this knowledge, we can't help but be more compassionate and understanding with children and ourselves. We have another video. It's on neglect. Neglect is considered to be one of the most damaging of the ACEs, and I can attest to that.
Everyone in a community has a vested interest in everyone else's children, because everyone else's children determine the next adult population that makes for a successful society. Built into our biology is the need to have responsive interactions with adults.
Neglect for children is when they don't get what the brain is expecting to get, what the child is expecting to get, what we are biologically prepared and waiting for, which is input from those around us.
It's this back and forth serve and return interaction that literally shapes the architecture of the brain.
Serve and return begins when a child looks at something or observes something, makes an utterance, and that represents the serve. And the return is when the parent notices the child doing these things and responds to the child.
Under conditions where serve and return is broken, you literally are pulling away what is the essential ingredient of the development of human brain architecture.
It was a really compelling series of experiments where they started by videotaping the mother and the baby engaging in cooing and smiling. And then they asked the mother to basically put on a blank face and not respond at all. When a baby is not attended to, that is a sign of danger to the baby biologically. So the stress systems become activated.
In a brain that is constantly bathed in stress hormones, not that's up and down, that comes with normal development, certain key synapses, the connections between nerves, fail to form, and critical regions of the brain.
So neglect both fails to provide the stimulation that's needed to develop the basic architecture, and when it's at a certain level, is one of the most potent activators of the stress biology of a young child. So you get a double whammy.
Science points to 4 categories of this spectrum of neglect. The first category would be what's called occasional inattention, where children experience responsiveness most of the time, but occasionally adults don't respond. There's no harm in that, and in fact, there's probably some benefit.
A child can learn to self-soothe and explore the environment, and all of those opportunities build brain architecture.
The second category, scientists would call chronic understimulation, is where on a regular basis, children have less interaction with the adults around them than is needed for healthy development.
Those children typically, when provided with enriched learning opportunities and more typical levels of serve and return, will show catch-up.
The third category is what science would call severe neglect in a family where not only are there prolonged periods of inattention and lack of responsiveness, but often also associated with not being fed enough, not being bathed enough, not having basic needs met.
Neglect is a huge problem in the U.S. Children are much more likely to be neglected than they are to experience any other kind of maltreatment.
We see the child really being at risk for much more substantial kinds of deficits down the road that don't necessarily get easily fixed or ameliorated. This is where we really need to think about more complicated and often more intensive strategies to help undo those effects.
The fourth category, called severe neglect, generally found in institutional settings, is a result of children living in kind of warehoused type situation in orphanages.
And it doesn't have to even be as extreme as orphanages. It can be experiences that are regretfully occurring in many, many parts of our country.
Often institutional care in this country is under the euphemistic name of transitional care or temporary care or assessment facilities.
If you think about what institutional or residential care would look like for an infant, where there's somebody new coming onto the shift every 8 hours, it really alters the development of the child's brain architecture and other aspects of the child's development.
We have the potential to change children's developmental trajectories.
Interventions can apply to parents, to foster parents or adoptive parents, child care settings, Head Start settings, and other kinds of settings. And really, what they're about is attuning people to the serve and return process.
Neglecting young children is neglecting the foundations of a healthy, next generation. The community pays a huge price later in terms of the problems of the next generation, whether it be educational achievement, economic productivity, good citizenship, the ability to parent the next generation. All of the things that have to do with a healthy, prosperous society.
Okay, checking in the chat. Was everyone able to see the full screen? Okay, great. Thank you very much. We wanted to check the technology. What was the essential message of this video? Relationships shape the biology of our brains. Therefore, children desperately need a connection to at least one caring, stable, consistent adult. And that is what builds resilience. We said that this workshop was about neuroscience and trauma and resilience, one caring, stable adult. There are numerous other resilience builders, but nothing beats at least one healthy, thriving relationship with someone a child can count on. When children are very young, they don't have a concept of separation. They perceive the universe as a part of themselves. So it's especially important for the adult caretakers to realize how strongly attached a child is to them. The list of problems that stem from neglect read like the manual of mental health disorders: poor impulse control, social withdrawal problems, coping issues, managing negative feelings and low self-esteem, and definitely low academic achievement. Now, researchers are beginning to understand some of the ways that early maltreatment affects a person's brain development and whether that damage can be undone. We have some information on how the hurt can be repaired. We'll explain this a little further in the webinar, but again, one caring, stable adult. Now, at the beginning of the video, Dr. Shonkoff said, everyone is invested in everyone else's children because everyone else's children determine the next adult population, which makes for a successful society. And it all starts at home. For instance, in a high verbal household, children know about 200 words by the age of 2. In a low verbal household, children know maybe 100 words. I'm going to guess in my house, I maybe had 65. As I mentioned earlier, in my home, there was no music, there was no books, no one read to me, no game playing, no guidance, ample criticism, and no belief that life had meaning. How could I have any? There were no conversations. There were plenty of conversations about the trouble I was getting into because I desperately craved attention. So I've struggled to relate with people my whole life because I had no reference for bonding early on. In addition to my desire to be of service to others with these webinars and workshops on a very personal level, I don't want kids to suffer the way I did. Now, before we begin the next section, I want to request again that everybody please click on the survey. It's in the chat, and it will give you more information on our work and allows for feedback, which we greatly appreciate. And the survey link should be in the chat. Let's go to the next slide. There we are. This is the key to a child's sense of security and safety. One caring, stable adult. It's a form of intervention, whether it's a parent, a teacher, a coach, etc. After hearing so much about the detrimental effects of ACEs, it all comes down to this: one caring, stable adult. You can do all the child therapy in the world, but this is the recipe for transformation, and dare I say, healing. Our genetic nature is to be neurologically connected to others, so relational health is essential for every child. Let's go to the next slide. When teachers and community service providers know about the ACE study and trauma-informed approaches, they can be lifesavers for the children. And the effectiveness of trauma awareness, along with the life skill, nonviolent communication, work together to create a safety net for traumatized kids and really for all children. And we've been sharing this with schools and child advocacy centers. As was just mentioned, in 2 weeks on Tuesday, November 21st, we will present another free webinar entirely on nonviolent communication at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, please put in your browser the link to this webinar. It should be in the chat. When we understand the neuroscience of ACEs and nonviolent communication, this adds a greater level of awareness and understanding about the effects of trauma. With our Healthy Relationships curriculum, our long-term vision is to help alleviate trauma and improve the health and well-being of children and their communities nationwide. Teachers, administrators, we can send you pages upon pages of testimonials saying how effective this work is, including a recent endorsement from Dr. Filiti, who is now a content provider for our curriculum. Details on our curriculum are also on our website, and the link to our curriculum is in the chat. Let's go to the next slide. This is my dad, Benjamin. He's on the right side. He's holding my aunt, and next to my aunt Polly is his brother Henry. My dad grew up on a farm outside of Lancaster City, and there was a fire in the barn, and Uncle Henry didn't make it out. My dad never told us. He died when I was 19, and I only found out about this a few years ago from one of my cousins, who's a bit of a historian. I have to imagine that my dad maybe was blamed and shamed and maybe even physically harmed for something that maybe he did not do. But he didn't know he didn't feel safe. How could he? He was 5 years old. He wasn't conscious of the effect of past emotional branding. And I have to imagine that he had been masking a great deal of loss for a very long time and felt himself not to be like other people, a stranger at life's party. This is how I have felt for most of my life. Let's go to the next slide. Here I am, young boy growing up in Lancaster. I'm smiling. I look happy. But was I? What did my teachers think? What did the neighbors think? There's no way they could have known my childhood was one of prolonged and chronic neglect, which had a toxic effect on my brain development. I grew up in what I would call punishing silence, and I grew up thinking that I wasn't wanted. It was as though I lived alone, isolated from humanity. Did any of you grow up in punishing silence? Or on the other hand, did you grow up in chaos and turmoil? Or did you grow up in micromanaging, hovering, and controlling? Maybe you grew up in a stable environment, stable and loving. Would you please put in the chat silence, chaos, controlling, or stable, or any combination? Please take a moment and put some answers in the chat. Again, as has been spoken earlier, once we have a sense of our own trauma and our ACEs, it begins the process of healing because we've been able to identify them very clearly. Thank you, everybody, for putting your answers in the chat, because we're not alone. So not every kid in the classroom is smiling and doing okay. They might be struggling with things that are masked by the smile. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, the life expectancy was 42. There was no penicillin, no antibiotics. You got a cut, got infected, you died. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, the human species is living to 90, twice as long as any humans ever lived. I'm sure my parents were very well-meaning, but they were likely replicating the parenting they received. I have to imagine the relationship models they grew up with were quite limited because life was about survival. What did they know about relationship dynamics? This is why we introduced the life skill, nonviolent communication, in schools and with social service organizations. So with these facts, I stopped blaming my parents for my despair. Wow, did I save a lot on therapy. In my world, there was a lack of familial affection, and family life was not a source of strength or support. It was unsteady, and the neglect I experienced churned out a damaging cocktail of stress neurochemicals that barraged my young body and mind. I marinated in inflammatory chemicals for a lifetime, which set the stage for a lack of fulfilling relationships and an inability to connect with others, let alone to learn. My ACEs became my unconscious rules for much of my waking life. Teachers, can you imagine that some of your students are also dealing with this? So society needs more insight into how early life experiences affect a child's mental health. Like my dad, I had been masking a great deal of pain for a very long time. And I too felt myself not to be like other people, a stranger in life's party. We have another link that's going to be in the chat. It's for donating to our foundation. If you make even a $5 donation or more, we'll send you a digital copy of our book that costs $12.95. In the book, you can read more about the ACE study and the trauma-informed school movement. Again, the donation link is in the chat. Please put it in your browser. We have done a tremendous amount of volunteer work in schools throughout the city and also with organizations that didn't have the funds. So we're very grateful for any amount. Let's go to the next slide. Children who are subjected to repeated adversities experience what is known as toxic stress. Toxic stress is dangerous and it can become chronic, and it's like an injury to the brain. The consequences for children are dire. The list is long. Secure attachment is either diminished or not present at all. They see the world as an unsafe place with no one there to help. They think they are insignificant and they don't trust adults. They feel isolated and have low self-esteem. They experience abandonment in all areas of their lives. When I became aware of my ACEs, it helped me put into perspective how I had been held back in my life goals and been unable to maintain healthy and thriving relationships. Before we go to the next slide, again, our Nonviolent Communication webinar is in 2 weeks, Tuesday, November 21st, again at 8 p.m. Eastern. There you will see how nonviolent communication supports resilience to trauma. This, again, is a no-charge webinar, and it's called How to Survive the Holidays with Nonviolent Communication. And the link should be in the chat. Now, in order to be trauma-informed, it's important to know how vital nurturing is, as well as the science of brain development. So here's some basic information on brain science. When we go to sleep, we drop into alpha, then theta, then the delta brainwave state. Delta is the deep sleep state. The first 2 years of a baby's life, they are perpetually in the delta brainwave state. They essentially live in a dream world, but with their eyes open. If we are abruptly awakened when we are sleeping, it can be quite shocking. So think of young children in that very sensitive state, except it's 24/7. So handle with care. Their day-to-day attention is on their inner world of feelings. So when they feel uncomfortable, they use their senses to see who or what caused it. Therefore, us adults hold the key to every child's future by the way we interact with them. Up to the first 6 years of a child's life, their perception of the world is limited to their subconscious mind. At around the age of 7 to 9, the beta brainwave state. The analytical mind becomes activated. Now a child begins to become more self-aware, separating the conscious mind from the subconscious mind. However, neuroscientists recently discovered that from birth to 3 in childhood is a critical window for their brain development. Early experiences remain encoded in the subconscious. We feel disappointment. How do we react? Well, the memories of every time that happened rush to the surface, and we react, or at least I did, react as though the past was now the present. We believe that in order to more effectively address trauma, the public needs to develop more science literacy, and we'll share a bit more of that in a moment. Neuroscientists recently discovered, as I said, it's from birth to 3. It's a critical window for the brain to develop. Before we begin this next section, I want to request that everyone please again click the link in the chat. It's for our survey. The survey gives you more information on our work, and it allows us to learn from feedback, which we greatly appreciate. And our survey is in the chat. Now, to broaden our perspective, let's look at some of the neuroscience. The limbic system is the area of the brain that communicates feelings to the brainstem and then to the spinal cord. The hippocampus and amygdala are part of a broad network of different brain functions in the limbic system. It's the survival system of the brain. You see them in the diagram. First, let's discuss the hippocampus. With chronic and repeated stress, the hippocampus, responsible for long and short-term memory, shrinks and becomes less effective in information retrieval. Here's an example. I'm going to guess when I was in elementary school, my teacher had us all repeat a basic math question like, what's 7 times 7? 5 minutes later, I was asked, what's 7 times 7? I couldn't remember. I couldn't remember much of anything. So experiencing criticism at school and at home over and over was stressful. One might even call it toxic stress. Now, after a half a century, I'm being exonerated for having poor memory. That was a long time in mental detention, if you know what I mean. And do you know any kids like me? Were you a kid like me? When there's trauma, the hippocampus shrinks. I'm going to guess my teachers either admonished me for not paying attention or rolled their eyes with disappointment. What we're now learning is that such responses or even judgmental gestures create more trauma. So teachers, counselors, adults everywhere, criticism is either verbal or negative. It only makes things worse. The gestures and the language cause more harm. Next is the amygdala, known for fight, flight, or freeze. When there's anxiety, worry, or fear, adrenaline and cortisol, the hormones of stress, are released into the blood system and into the brain. Adrenaline and cortisol are neurotransmitters. This means they directly influence brain function. You see a bear in the woods. What happens? Your adrenaline starts to pump. Well, here's an analogy. An abusive parent is like the bear who comes home, but the problem for some children is the bear comes home at night. So repeated stress and trauma can result in a child becoming hypervigilant and constantly on alert. Trauma also affects the prefrontal cortex, which is critical to concentration, focus, learning, decision-making, planning, logic, and perspective taking. Science now shows that the response humans have to daily stress is similar to the stress response we had when we were running away from a saber-toothed tiger, except our daily stress is not life-threatening. Daily challenges are not life-threatening, but how often do we act as though they are? Do you know people who act like their stress is life-threatening? When a truck suddenly comes at us, adrenaline rushes and we get out of the way. For way too many children, the trauma in their lives can be like dodging trucks all day. When an adult, especially a teacher, reprimands a child, they generally experience it as discomfort. In a way, it's like dodging another truck. Research now shows that the punishment model is actually counterproductive and generally creates more problems. Simply put, punishment affects memory and it affects the entire prefrontal cortex, which is critical to learning and processing information. Let's take a further look at the inside of our brains. Neurons. We have 86 million neurons. And neurons are brain cells that transmit electrical signals to each other. Neurons are constantly firing and wiring. We are endlessly learning. During childhood, elevated levels of stress hormones can lead to diminished neuron production. This is a synapse. It's a gap between two neurons. This is where electrical signals travel from one neuron to another. This is known as firing. As we exercise our brain, like we are doing tonight, by learning new things and practicing new skills, we form new synaptic connections, and this is known as wiring. Let's go to the next slide. Here's a look at our neural network. It's really busy right behind our eyes. Let's go to the next slide. Our genes are responsible for our inherited traits. However, inheriting a gene doesn't mean that our genes will express the same characteristics as our parents. In schools, environmental factors are hallways, classrooms, the school bus, the cafeteria, and the playground. They all play some sort of role in determining how our genes will manifest. And it's the same thing at home. Bullied students suffer from a kind of PTSD, and they're constantly looking for roadside bombs. What if school-age children learned that stress that their classmates experience from bullying can actually lead to diminished mental and physical health? With this scientific fact, they might begin to think twice about bullying anyone. And the same goes for behavior for a child at home. Now, science tells us that the most chronic health conditions inherited genes of those conditions only make up 10 to 20% of the risk. 80 to 90% are environmental factors. So if you have a gene in one of your cells that is coded for a certain disease, and there's a history of it in your family, there's less of a chance of it developing if one lives a healthy, low-stress lifestyle. What if adults had to learn about serve and return before having children? What if we all had to take a parenting test once we decided to have children? What if we were told that the results would determine how a child would develop emotionally, physically, and later determine how they would perform in school, at work, and in all their relationships? Again, coming back to my childhood, I never had a chance to excel because my environment was not favorable to my developing brain, a mind that yearned to learn. If only my teachers had known about basic brain science, they could have helped me become a valued member of the school community. So if a child is struggling at home, ideally, we want them to feel as though they've been handed a life raft when they walk through the school doors. And that life raft is called safety and stability. Dare I say, love. And on that note, in 2 weeks on Tuesday, the 21st of November at 8 p.m., we're going to explain in detail how to establish and nourish this positivity. It's our monthly webinar on nonviolent communication, and the link to it is in the chat. Let's go to the next slide. Neurons that are no longer in use can unwire. It's called pruning, just like pruning a bush. Neurological pruning can clear the way for potential positive influences. We can sprout new neurological connections, so there's hope for our brains. We say When we put this all together, we can see that troubled kids and adults don't have a behavior problem. With basic knowledge of brain architecture, we can see they have a brain problem. And let's go to the next slide. And their disruptive behavior is a coping mechanism. And adults and children with ACEs respond to the world as a place of constant danger. Their disruptive behaviors are actually coping mechanisms. A trauma-informed approach sees children as their circumstances, not their behavior. For some, especially teachers, this can be a hard pill to swallow. But by seeing children beyond their behaviors, it opens the door for greater connection and understanding. Resilience is the ability to function in a healthy way, even in the face of trauma. Just one caring, stable adult can affect a child's brain chemistry and its healthy development. So nothing is a substitute for relationship building. And there's a film called Paper Tigers. It's on a streaming service that I'm not going to mention because it's gotten a little too big. But you can find it, Paper Tigers. It's where we see that replicating the punishment model and replacing it with care, communication, and compassion in a 3-year period, suspensions went from 796 to 135, and graduation rates went up 5 times. And this is a school that kids went to who were suspended from the city school. What school doesn't want those results? And the principal of that school has endorsed our curriculum and our book. Let's go to the next slide. Very simply, relationships drive brain development. So relationships are everything. Let's go to the next slide. We say change happens at the speed of trust. Humans are a marvel of adaptability and change. In this work, there's the potential for kids and adults to break free from the chains of their emotional past, the trauma and the chaos. There's the potential for all of us to develop a genius mind. We have our survey in the chat. Please use it to give us your feedback on the presentation. Please take a moment to give us your feedback in the survey. And you can click the link. It should be in our chat now. The survey will also give you more information on our work. And let's go to the next slide. Here's our contact information. And one last time, please help us get this work out beyond these webinars and make even a $5 donation or more. And we will send you a digital copy of our book that costs $12.95. In the book, you can read more about the ACE study, trauma-informed schools. The donation link is in the chat. And please put it in your browser. Let's go to one last slide. We really believe this saying by Victor Hugo, there's nothing stronger in the world than an idea whose time has come. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we will now go to any comments anyone would like to make.